Hello, friends. So if you're new here, welcome. Hi, I'm Emily. We are in the middle of doing a series that is all about objections to Christianity. So one of the objections that I got was basically there's too much suffering in the world for me to believe in anything. And I just want to say, that's a very valid concern. I think it's so good that we're concerned about the suffering of the world. And it's tough, it's something that every Christian has to wrestle with. Every person has to wrestle with. Before we begin, I just thought it was really interesting when this person responded. They said, I don't believe in anything because of the suffering. And I just want to be clear, even if you don't believe in Christianity, you believe in something. You have, whether it's conscious or not, you have some understanding of why you think the world is the way that it is. And that could very simply be, you know what, I think that they're suffering because the world is a cruel place. There's no rhyme or reason. It's the way we evolved. And the only thing that I can do is to be kind and generous to the people around me. That is a belief. That is a belief on how you think the world functions and works. So let's just be clear that everyone has beliefs about why they're suffering. We all say things to justify the suffering or to explain it. And I just think that we need to think about our answers to the question of suffering and what answers satisfy us most. Which ones give us the most hope? And so I think, and I've found that the problem of suffering is answered best in Christianity. And so I'm going to present that to you today. Let's do this. So clearly, suffering is sucky. I think we can all agree to that. No one's like, you know what I want to do today? Suffer. But I think it's important to remember when we're coming from a Christian worldview, these are the things that Christians believe. One, there's a God who's in control. I recognize that when you're in the middle of suffering, it is not always the easiest thing to hear that God is in control. Sometimes it just feels like a slap in the face. Okay, well, if he's in control, why isn't he stopping this? We're going to get to that, but that is what Christians believe. We do believe that God is in control of every single thing that goes on in the world. Another thing that Christians believe is that Jesus himself suffered, and that is a source of comfort and hope. We're not alone in our suffering because he himself suffered and went through it, the depths of it, the deepest, darkest suffering you can imagine, and he's been there and he knows it. Another thing for the Christian worldview is that we expect suffering, and that might sound kind of weird, but we aren't surprised. We're not like, oh, wow, in a world full of sinful people, we have to suffer? No way. We're not surprised by it. One thing that I find really hopeful in the Christian worldview as it relates to suffering is that there is this promise that God gives that the suffering will end. And he doesn't promise this in this lifetime. If I'm suffering with a chronic illness, I'm not promised that I will end that suffering in this lifetime. I'm promised something different. So in the Bible, just as a quick reference for what I'm about to read, there's a book called Revelation, and it is the vision that this man gets about what the end times are going to look like. So the end of the world, Judgment Day, and all this crazy stuff. Very interesting read. It's called Revelation, and at the end of Revelation, in chapter 21, the author is seeing God create a new earth and a new heaven. And this is what he sees. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eye. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who is seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. And the vision goes on to just describe this beautiful place where God is with his people and every suffering is gone. And this is the place that God prepares for those who love him. And that is crazy hope, because we might suffer for 80 years of our life. And when we get to our deathbed, we know we're going home. And there is something so much greater and a place where all our suffering ceases. And that's wonderful. And unfortunately, a worldview without God doesn't account for that. It's just, we suffer up and down in this life. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes the suffering ends, sometimes it doesn't. But what happens after? There's no sure hope of a time with no suffering. But there is in the Christian worldview, because God loves us and is preparing a place for us and is making all things new. So a good friend of mine is in the fire of suffering right now. Like the waters and the waves and the everything, like up to her neck. And it sucks. I can't lie. She's a Christian. And though it's painful and though the suffering sucks, this is what she says. Hope is not contingent on circumstances, but on a person, who is Jesus. She also says that the things that are important to know and remember in suffering are that the Father of all comfort comforts us. Jesus knows suffering because he suffered too, and Jesus is devoted to us in our suffering. We're not alone in it. Those are the things that are promised in the Christian worldview as it relates to suffering. When you're in it, you're not alone. And even though it may not end in this life, it will in another, because God cares about us and he's preparing a place for us. So I made the claim that God is making a new heaven and a new earth. That's our hope. It begs the question, did he make a mistake with this one? Like, why is there suffering here? Why not just start with the new heaven and the new earth where there's no crying and no tears and no pain? Like, why not just start with that? First of all, no, he didn't make a mistake. He doesn't make mistakes. He's God. He's in control. He knows what he's doing. That being said, I recognize that knowing that God is in control is not always the most helpful thing when you're in the middle of suffering, because you think to yourself, like, well, wouldn't he fix this? Like, why not just take away the suffering? I don't understand. And that's valid. Like, that's so valid. I've linked some really great resources below, and one of them is from the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And there's a beautiful quote that I love that just, it's not going to answer all the questions, and I get that. This is something that every single person has to work through and every Christian has to come to an understanding of, but I thought this was really helpful. He says, a loving parent is not the one who never allows suffering in the child's life. The loving parent is the one who is willing to suffer alongside the child. And in Christianity, this is exactly what we find. This is my thoughts now. That's the whole thing. I mean, when you really think about it, do your parents make sure that you never suffer? No, well, they can't really do that, granted. They could try, but honestly, they don't always, because they know that you will grow from it, and they were willing to suffer alongside of you. If you're hurting, they'll hurt too. And I know also, as I'm saying this, that not everyone has perfect parents. Nobody has perfect parents, actually, but some of our parents are really bad, you know? And so it's hard sometimes to hear those analogies and not feel like, man, if God's anything like my parents, I do not want anything to do with him. And I get that. But God is so not like your parents. Even if you have perfect parents, he is like crazy good. He is the perfect parent. And he is exactly what parents are supposed to be. And it sucks when parents fall short of that. So that's my quick rant about parents. But that's why I love that imagery, because I think it just helps us understand a little bit of God doesn't need to change our suffering because he's suffering with us. Now we're going on to a little more of an intellectual note. So I don't want to over-intellectualize this, but I also recognize that some of us need that. So please don't take this the wrong way. I'm not minimizing your suffering by thinking about it. So before I start, there's another resource down below which walks through this entire problem of evil argument. It's very simple, like very approachable. It's not high and lofty. I mean, I could read it and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And so I'm gonna try to give you, to the best of my ability, my paraphrased version of that. But if you're interested, there is a bunch more in this article that you should check out. Basically, the argument with the problem of evil is this. I'm just gonna read it off of their site because it's put really well. So basically we think along these lines. 1, a perfectly powerful being can prevent evil. 2, a perfectly good being will prevent evil as far as he can. 3, God is both perfectly powerful and perfectly good. 4. So if a perfectly powerful and good God exists, there will be no evil. 5. There is evil. 6. Therefore, God does not exist. And there you have it. We have disproved Christianity. So it's like that seems to make sense, right? Like I was walking through that and I was like, wait a minute. Is my religion a lie? But when you think about it, you have to say, is the second premise true? The second premise is that if someone is perfectly good, they will prevent evil as far as they can. Is that true? No, that's not actually true. So one of the basic premises of this argument is false, therefore the conclusion can't be true either. So a few reasons why premise 2 is false and how God deals with the problem of suffering in our world. So 1, God aims for great goods. So he aims for great goods for us, for himself, for the world. God often intends evil for good. What that means is that there are goods which come about by evil. And 3, this is the annoying one, is that God created us in the dark about a lot of these things, i.e., we don't understand. Like, we don't get why he's doing certain things. We don't see the greater good. We don't see how it all connects. If you're interested, there is a book in the Bible. It's called the Book of Job. And basically the synopsis of the Book of Job is that God takes away everything Job has. I kid you not, like all of his animals, his land, his house, his wife, his kids. Job got sick, whole body covered in sores, like gross. Evil, right? Suffering, right? And yet, the Bible says that that was good for Job, that God was using it for good. Check out the resource below for a better understanding of this book, but this is one of those books that deals with suffering well, because it's like, will this suffering ever end? And yet, God was using evil for a greater good. Whether that greater good was for God, whether that greater good was for the world, was that for Job? Job didn't know. When he was in it and he was suffering, he had no idea. And some of us will go our entire lives suffering and have no idea why we're suffering, and that is really hard. And I know that it's hard to think, like, there's a God out there who has a reason for what he's doing. Why won't he just tell me? And I get it. It's hard. I get it. I wish that he did, honestly. But for some reason, he knows that it's good, and we just don't know. The question of suffering is really hard. But to summarize, we all have a belief about suffering, about why there's suffering, and I believe that the Christian view of suffering provides the most hope and the most security, knowing that there's a God who cares for you, who suffers with you, who is intending every suffering for good, even when we don't understand it. And I know that that's hard in the middle of suffering, but those are the truths. That is what Christianity believes, and that is where we find our hope in the middle of suffering, even though it may never end in this life. We may continue suffering, but one day it will end. Like, we will get to that place if we love Jesus, where we are with him forever. There's no more crying or tears or pain. And unfortunately, the flip side is that if we don't love Jesus and if we don't put our faith and our trust in him, that place isn't for us. There's a different place, a place filled with suffering, nonstop, all the time. Worse than earth, like way worse. On that happy note, the suffering that Jesus experienced when he was tortured and killed was horrid. And yet he did it for us, which is why he can meet us in our suffering now. He knew that our lives would be full of sin and suffering and pain and hate, and he loved us and loves us so much that he chose to willingly be killed and to suffer that pain and suffer the wrath of God being poured out on him. And it's that kind of love that gives us hope in our suffering. That's why I believe in Jesus. That's why I've put my faith and my hope and my trust in him. And that's why I think Christianity offers or the best answer to the problem of evil and suffering, because Jesus himself suffered and he became victorious over all evil, all sin, all death forever. Oh man, that was a lot. That was a lot. Thank you for sticking with it. Christian or not, if you like this video, make sure to subscribe, because I do a lot of videos talking about Christianity and things that I feel like the church doesn't talk enough about. So if that interests you, if that's your cup of tea, please like and subscribe, comment, say hi. I'd love to connect with you guys. And check out all the resources down below. Follow me on Instagram, do all that stuff. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.